Today we're going to kind of step back in time a little bit for a few years, and we're going to look at the events in David's life that occurred just before he was anointed the king of all of Israel. Our scripture comes from 2 Samuel chapter 2 verses 1 to 7, and 1 Chronicles chapter 11 verses 1 to 3. Now, as we were growing up, there were always milestones in our lives, and we just couldn't wait to see pass. I mean, do you ever remember thinking, boy, I can't wait until I can cross the street all by myself? Or I can't wait until I can go to school. We wanted to be older so bad that we didn't tell people that we were 6 years old. We told them we were 6.5 years old. Then came the time that we would really like to drop a few years off of that number. One of the longest and most difficult delays in my life was the time I spent waiting to drive legally. You see, I had actually started to drive as soon as I was old enough to reach the pedals. In fact, I was actually driving a very large tractor when they had to tie wood blocks to the pedals so that I can reach them. You see, I lived part of my year every year with my grandparents on a tobacco farm in North Carolina. And there was a lot of places on that farm where I could drive legally even when I was 10 years old. But I couldn't go cruising down the 2 blocks of pavement that made up Stantonsburg, North Carolina, until I turned 16 and I got my driver's license. Until then, I would not have the opportunity to stop at the only traffic light in town and let everybody see me sitting behind the wheel. Well, I found it very difficult to wait for this to happen, and I have to confess that I've gotten older. I have not gotten any better at waiting. Yeah. I want things to happen instantly. There's a peanut gallery. I want things to happen instantly, and I get very impatient if they don't. Now, having admitted that, I feel that it's my duty to remind you that you don't like waiting for things any better than I do. I mean, why do you think we have so many fast food restaurants around today? And why do you think we have instant potatoes and cook our food on microwave ovens? It's all because people don't like to wait for anything. Well, as we look at the life of David, we can see that he spent a whole lot of his life waiting. David waited for 15 years from the time that he was first anointed by Samuel until he became king of anything. But that's because he was only about 10 years old when that happened. At first, he was only the king of Judah. It would be another 7 years before David would be anointed as king over the entire nation of Israel. That meant that David had to wait at least 22 years before God finally gave him the throne of all of Israel. Well, how David handled these 2 decades of delay is the subject of today's lesson. How David lived his life during those days of waiting can teach us a great deal about waiting on the Lord. Now, before we look at today's scripture passage, I want to take a few moments and review the events that led up to it. God was finished with Saul. Saul had disobeyed God for the last time, so God abandons Saul, and Saul's kingdom is doomed. As a result, God sends Samuel to the town of Bethlehem to anoint Saul's replacement. Well, when Samuel arrives in Bethlehem, David isn't there. You see, never in their wildest dreams did anyone think that a scrawny little kid like David could ever be considered as king material. I mean, after all, he wasn't even a teenager yet. So they didn't bother to invite him. He was off doing what most young boys did in those days. He was out on the field tending a small flock of sheep for his father. Well, you all know what happened. I mean, David was called, Samuel anointed him as king, and David began his wait. David must have wondered how long it would take before he would become king. As a 10-year-old, the whole idea must have scared him a little bit. He may have envisioned a peaceful transfer of power. He figured that he would work alongside of Saul as a member of Saul's court, and that way he could learn the ropes and he could take over king when Saul died. But the road to the throne turns out to be much more difficult than David ever imagined. I would imagine that this was God's plan all along. The difficulties that David went through were designed to make him strong enough to weather the storms that he was going to have to cope with when he was king. Well, David does end up in the palace, and he does end up working for Saul. See, as soon as God's Spirit was removed from Saul, he started being tormented by evil spirits. Personally, I think this torment manifested itself in physical ways. I think that Saul started experiencing tremendous headaches that were sometimes accompanied by irrational behavior. Well, one of Saul's servants figured that a little music just might be the thing that Saul needs to calm him down. After all, didn't they say that music soothes the savage beast? Well, apparently David was an accomplished musician and songwriter, so another of the Saul's servants recommended David for the job. So David begins his career in the palace as Saul's private musician and his armor bearer. Well, here he is, he's in the palace. Surely it can't be very long before he'll take over as king, but David was only a part-time musician. When he wasn't playing his harp for Saul, he was still living at home with his father, and he goes to the palace whenever Saul feels the need for some soothing harp music. Well, war breaks out with the Philistines again, and the minimum age for military service in ancient Israel was 20 years. And it would seem that David is still too young to join the army. So he stays at home minding his father's sheep. Now, each of these two armies is camped out on the side of a hill with a valley in between them. And whoever attacks first will be at a disadvantage because the army that would be defending, the other army would be defending the high ground, and that's much easier. So both of these armies were just sort of sitting there staring at each other and wondering who was going to make the first move. Well, it wasn't unusual in those days for armies to settle battles by appointing champions to fight for them. Each army would pick their best warriors to represent them, and these two representatives would then engage in a fight to the death. It was agreed ahead of time that if your champion lost, you would surrender. I guess they figured that this was a more civilized way to settle the matter. Well, the Philistine champion was a 9-foot 9-inch tall man named Goliath. His name has worked its way into our language to describe anything that is unusually large. Goliath's armor alone weighed 125 pounds, and that didn't include his shin guards, his shield, and his weapon. Well, every day, Goliath would walk out into the middle of the valley between the two armies, and he would challenge the Israelites to send out their best man to fight them. Of course, the Israelite soldiers weren't exactly falling all over each other trying to get out there to fight him. Now, it's important to take note here that listed among the men who refused to challenge Goliath was Saul and his cousin Abner. Saul was the king, and Abner had been placed in charge of the Israeli army. They were just as frightened of Goliath as the rest of the men were. You see, cowardice in the ranks suggests that there's cowardice in the leadership as well. Well, you all know what happened. David goes to the front lines to take a lunch to his 3 older brothers. And when he hears this Philistine giant mocking the Israelites, he can't understand why no one will take up the challenge. After all, isn't God on their side? So what's the problem? Well, when David's brother hears what he said, they get very angry with David. His oldest brother, Eliab, says, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left these few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." Well, David answers like most teenagers would. He says, and David said, "What have I done? Was it not but a word?" Well, David goes to Saul, and he volunteers to fight Goliath himself. At first, Saul thinks he's crazy. But David tells Saul about all the lions and bears that he had killed in order to protect his father's sheep. So Saul eventually gives in, and he gives David the armor and sword to use, his armor and sword to use. But since David is just a boy, Saul's armor is too heavy for him to handle. Then David said to Saul, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in his shepherd's pouch, his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Maybe Saul had heard that Samuel had anointed David to be the next king, and he figured that this was a good way to get rid of him. He also figured that when David lost the fight, he could tell the Philistines that he really hadn't sent David, he just went on his own, and he was sure the Philistines wouldn't want to tell everybody they had won the battle by killing the scrawny teenager. Now, there is a great lesson for us in that statement. Don't try to be something that you're not. Don't try to do something that you're not called to do. Friends, if God has called you to use a slingshot, then don't try to use a sword. If God has called you to sing in the choir, then sing in the choir. If God has called you to do something else, then do it. And make sure that you do it God's way. Don't try to use a sword if a slingshot will do. Now, a lot of people will question David's faith because he took 5 stones instead of only 1. They say that he was afraid that he might miss, and so they took enough stones so that if he missed, he had another shot. They say that this shows that he didn't have enough faith to believe that God would give him the victory. They feel that he should have trusted God enough to know that one stone would do the job if God was guiding him. But see, David had no intention of missing. And he fully understood that God was going to give him the victory over Goliath. Do you honestly think that he would have volunteered to fight Goliath if he didn't believe that? Okay, if that's true, then why did he take 5 stones instead of 1? The answer is found in 2 Samuel 21, verse 22. It seems that Goliath had 4 brothers who were almost as big as he was. And David assumed that as soon as he had killed Goliath, his 4 brothers would then try to kill him. So he took 5 stones. There was 1 for Goliath and 1 for each of Goliath's 4 brothers. But with God on his side, David knew that he wouldn't need any more than that. Well, David kills Goliath, and the Philistine army doesn't keep their end of the bargain. Instead of surrendering, they all turn tail and run. And the Israelites take off in hot pursuit. David is an instant national hero. The people love David, and so does Saul. As a reward, Saul makes David a captain in his army, and everywhere that David went, the Lord made sure that he was victorious. Now, the irony is, it's David's music that calms Saul's troubled spirit. But it's music that was written about David that pushes Saul over the edge and causes him to start hating David. Seems that one day after one of David's many victories over the Philistines, Saul and David are riding into town at the head of the victory parade when a bunch of women come out to greet them. Well, actually, they had come out to greet David. You see, they weren't interested in Saul at all. Remember, David was a rather handsome young man. So these young women followed David around sort of like if he was a rock star. Well, as David and Saul were riding into town at the head of the victory parade, the women start singing, "Saul has struck down his thousands, but David his 10,000s." Well, in those days, whenever a country would win a victory over an enemy, regardless of who was actually responsible for the victory, the king always got the credit. So Saul takes this as an insult, and he is furious at David for upstaging him. You see, even though David was the one who was doing all these things, Saul was the king, and as the king, he felt that he should get the lion's share of the credit. Well, at first, Saul doesn't say anything. He keeps his anger to himself. David is just too popular with the people for Saul to take a chance of having them turn against him by killing David himself. So he tries to arrange David's death. He tries to put David into military situations where he'll be killed by the Philistines. Years later, David arranged the death of Bathsheba's husband Uriah by doing the same thing. Well, everything that Saul does to arrange David's death backfires on him, and David is more popular than ever. Now, one day, Saul's anger against David went public. While David was playing his harp, Saul was holding onto his spear, and suddenly Saul just went bananas, and he threw his spear at David. But David ducked, and the spear missed him. This happened twice, but each time Saul would make an excuse, and David accepted it. See, Saul was prone to these occasional violent outbursts. Well, apparently Saul tells David that it might be a good idea if he went away for a little while until he could sort out this problem with the spear. So he makes David a commander over 1,000 men. Remember, David was still a very young man at this time, so Saul figures that there's no way that David could handle this job. Well, up until that point, David had been pretty successful in small skirmishes with the Philistines. But Saul assumes that if it had to be David's men that were winning these victories, and David was just taking the credit. Surely he'll be killed in the first major battle. Now, it didn't seem to bother Saul that David's men would probably be killed along with him. Well, Saul tries to arrange a battle for David to die in, and as an incentive, He offers to give David the hand of his daughter Merab if he would fight a few battles with the Philistines first. Saul figures that that would be the end of David. But instead of being killed, which is what Saul wanted, David wins every battle he fights. Now, so Saul wasn't expecting to ever see David alive again. He marries his daughter off before David returns. So when David does return, Saul has a problem. Well, have no fear, unbeknownst to Saul, it seems that his daughter Michal had fallen madly in love with David. So she volunteers to marry David, and Saul agrees. But in those days, you had to buy your bride, and brides were very expensive items. So there's this little matter of the price that David must pay for the bride. Saul is the king, so he doesn't need any money. So instead, Saul asked David to do a little favor for him before the wedding. He asked David to go out and kill 100 Philistines. Saul figures that this way he would surely guarantee David's death. And if by some miracle David did survive to marry Michal, she could be a spy for him. Well, I guess you know that David did not kill 100 Philistines. He killed 200 Philistines. So David and Michal are married. But when Saul finds out that Michal really does love David, and she will not be a spy for him, he is furious. So David gains a wife who loves him, and he wins the admiration of everyone in Israel, that is, except for Saul. Well, it seems that David and Saul's son Jonathan had become very close friends. But Saul gives an order to Jonathan as well as to all of his other servants to kill David on sight. But Jonathan wins a temporary reprieve for David, and at least he thinks he has. You see, all Saul did was stop trying to kill David himself. Instead, he hires some hitmen to do it for him. Well, it isn't too long before David wins a few more victories against the Philistines, and Saul gets so mad that he throws the spear at David again, but David escapes. Then Saul sends his hitmen to try to kill David in his own home. But their efforts are thwarted by Saul's daughter Michal. From this point on, David keeps his distance from Saul. First he turns to Samuel for help. Then he turns to Jonathan. It's very evident that David will no longer be able to get along with Saul. He has to become a fugitive as Saul and his men try to track him down and kill him. Well, David ends up going to the town of Gath in order to help him get help from the Philistine king Achish, who lived there. But given the fact that Gath is Goliath's hometown, that was kind of a strange place for him to go. And at first, he was afraid that Achish might try to harm him because of all the Philistines that David had killed. Well, in the Philistine culture, you did not do anything that might harm someone who was insane. So David starts acting a little bit goofy so that the Philistines would think that he was insane and they wouldn't harm him. Well, as strange as that may seem, David and his 600 men end up living in a palace with Achish. And goofy or not, the Philistine king kind of takes a liking to David. So David stops acting goofy and asks Achish for a place that he and his men can live, and Achish gives him the town of Ziklag to be his very own. Now, unbeknownst to the Philistines, David starts raiding their allies using Ziklag as his home base. David has a few close calls with Saul, but God always seemed to step in and make sure that David is safe. In fact, David even has a few opportunities to kill Saul, but he always spares Saul's life. Well, eventually the Philistines go to war with Israel, and it appears that David is going to have to fight with the Philistines against Israel. But God sees to it that that doesn't happen. When David returns to Ziklag, he finds that the city has been sacked by the band of Amalekites, and the wives and families of David and his men have been taken prisoner. So David and his men take off after the Amalekites to rescue their families. When they return to Ziklag, David gets word that Saul, Jonathan, and 3 of Saul's other sons have been killed in the battle with the Philistines. And we talked about this last week. And this brings us to today's scripture passage. 15 years have passed since David was anointed by Samuel to be the next king of Israel. During that period of time, David has gone from being a lowly shepherd boy who was tending a few sheep for his father to being a beloved member of Saul's household. Then he became a man with great military ability and was the hero of Israel. Even so, none of this brings about Saul's downfall or David's appointment as his replacement. Then David falls out of favor with Saul and he becomes a fugitive. Now, this doesn't happen as a result of anything that David had done wrong. It comes about because he trusted God and was loyal to the king, and he was successful in what he did. And because of that, David is no longer the rising star in Israel that everyone wants to be associated with. Instead, he becomes a fugitive that no one wants to be around because they're afraid that Saul might do them harm. But remember, all of those different experiences are going to work together to make David a better king. But God is not ready for him to be king just yet. In fact, it will be another 7 years before David assumes the throne over all of Israel. Okay, this is where we stand now. After 15 years of waiting, and most of it spent running from Saul, David has learned that Saul, Jonathan, and 3 of Saul's other sons are dead. Then in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 1, we read, after this, meaning that the period of mourning for Saul and Jonathan was over, David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah? David knows that God has called him to be the king, and he wants to get on with it. He doesn't hide among the suitcases like Saul did. He's ready and willing to get to work, but he wants to go about it God's way. So David asked the most important question anyone can ever ask. God, what do you want me to do? In other words, Lord, what is the right thing to do? Remember, David is still living in Ziklag. He isn't even in Israel. And he'll have to go there if he's going to be the king of Israel. So he asked God to tell him what to do. You know, a lot of Christians today seem to feel that God's will is one of the most difficult things to discover. I mean, what does God want me to do? In reality, the only thing that is difficult for us to do is to bring ourselves to ask that question in the first place and to be truly honest with God when we do ask it. But more often than not, instead of asking God to show us what to do, we ask God, this is what I want to do, are you okay with it? But a heart that has been totally given over to doing what is right doesn't really have very much trouble finding out what the right thing is. God reserves his answers for those who really mean business. Fact is, most Christians who come to God asking that question are afraid that God's answer will upset their plans. So instead of listening to God's answer, they desperately try to convince themselves of what they wanted to do was really what God wanted them to do in the first place. Well, David's question is sincere, and the Lord said to him, go up. David says, to which shall I go up? And he said, to Hebron. Hebron is in the southern part of Israel, and it's very close to the Philistine border. In David's day, it was called Kiriath Arba, which means the town of four. It's possible that it got that name because Hebron was really the biggest of 4 separate towns that sort of operated as one. In any case, one of these divisions was called Mamre. Now, we don't usually talk very much about Hebron, but in those days, Hebron was quite a famous place. Abraham spent quite a few years in Mamre, which is only a few miles away from Hebron itself. In fact, Abraham was living in Mamre when the pagan kings in that area captured his nephew Lot. This is also the place where God changed his name from Abram to Abraham. Abraham was also in that area when the angels came and told him that he would have a son named Isaac. Later on, Abraham's wife Sarah died in Hebron. She was buried in the cave at Machpelah, which is nearby. After the exodus from Egypt, the 12 spies that Moses sent into Canaan went to Hebron. Joshua eventually captured Hebron from the Canaanites, and he killed the Canaanite king during that conquest. Later on, Caleb, who was the only other spy besides Joshua who wanted to enter Canaan, would claim the city as his inheritance. So Hebron was a good place for David to go. First, because God wanted David to move cautiously. You see, he is not to go to Israel and just take over, but he is to go and make himself available. Second, Hebron is located in a valley that forms a natural fortress, so it's very easy to defend. In fact, it was said that Hebron could be defended by a handful of lame blind men. So David obeys God, and he goes to Hebron, and he stays there for 7.5 years. Well, when David arrives in Hebron, the men of his own tribe, Judah, anoint him as the king of Judah. To find out the significance of this act, we need to look back at the story of Jacob and his 12 sons. Judah was Jacob's fourth son. His mother was Jacob's first wife, Leah. Well, when Jacob's sons wanted to kill their brother Joseph, Judah is the one who saved his life by suggesting that instead of killing him, they should sell him to the Ishmaelite merchants who were on their way to Egypt. Then, when the brothers were finally reunited with Joseph in Egypt, it was Judah who begged Joseph to keep him as the hostage instead of Benjamin, because he knew how much his father loved Benjamin. And it was Judah that confessed that what he and his brothers had done to Joseph. See, Judah was a natural leader among Jacob's 12 sons. This is why Jacob declared that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor this ruler's staff from between his feet. Well, Jacob's other sons sort of resented that idea. Judah was also the strongest of the tribes, but the tribal rivalry would eventually end up with the kingdom being divided. Well, when David hears that the men of Jabesh-Gilead were the ones who had taken Saul's body and given it a proper burial, David responds as a king should respond. First, he executes the Amalekite who had admitted to killing Saul. Then he commends the men of Jabesh-Gilead for showing kindness to Saul. Now notice what David says to them in verse 7. Now therefore, let your hands be strong and be valiant. For Saul, your Lord, is dead, and also the house of Judah has anointed me king over them. David makes sure to tell them that the tribe of Judah had already anointed him as their king. And Judah is the largest and the most powerful of the tribes of Israel. This was an indirect way of letting everybody know that he is available to be anointed as king over the rest of Israel as well. He doesn't try to take over by force. Instead, he says, Judah named me as their king, and I would like nothing better than to have the rest of you come into the fold as well. Well, the reason that the rest of Israel didn't acknowledge David as their king right away is a man named Abner. Abner was Saul's cousin, and he was the commander of the Israeli army. Now, there is no way that Abner could justify his actions. After all, he knew as well as anyone else did that God had chosen David to be the next king of Israel. But Abner defies God by installing Saul's son Ishbosheth as king. And nobody was going to argue with him as long as he had control of the army. But why Ishbosheth? Well, Ishbosheth was really a nobody. He was a wimp. He was fourth in line to the throne, and he was the son of a concubine at that. Well, who would have ever guessed that the fourth in line would have had any chance at all of becoming the king? So no one had ever prepared him to be the king. Ishbosheth was totally unqualified for the job, but he was Saul's son. You see, if Abner had tried to take over the throne for himself, the people may have objected. But Abner does feel that the people will accept Ishbosheth as their king simply because of blood succession. That would save him the trouble and the expense of taking the throne by force in a civil war. You see, since Ishbosheth is so weak, Abner could very easily control him and become the true power behind the throne. This was just Abner's roundabout way of trying to take over the throne for himself. Well, David doesn't oppose either one of these men, and it's not because he was afraid of them. Remember, he knows that God is on his side, but instead he seems to be adopting the principle that Paul would write about centuries later. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Now, no one would even suggest that Ishbosheth had been made the king by popular demand. They also knew that Abner's intentions in putting Ishbosheth on the throne weren't exactly honorable. Abner was out for himself, and Ishbosheth just went along for the ride. Even so, David concedes that he will rule as the king of Judah, and Ishbosheth can rule in the rest of Israel. So that must mean that God must want him there. So David will not oppose Ishbosheth's right to rule. Now, one factor in that decision was the fact that many years earlier, David had made a promise to Saul that he would never oppose Saul or his descendants. So he doesn't remove Ishbosheth as king, and so he can't remove Ishbosheth as king, and so keep his promise to Saul. You see, David is a man of principle. He is a man who will wait 7 more years just to keep his promise to Saul. He is a man who is willing to wait on the Lord. Well, at this point, David sort of bows out of the picture temporarily. Even though David is mentioned, the main players in this point in time are Abner, who was the commander of the Israeli army, and Joab, who was the commander of the military forces of Judah. Well, these two men meet at a pond in Gibeon, and they agree to hold a senseless contest in which each one appoints 12 champions, and they are to fight to the death. Well, all 24 of these contestants end up being killed. And since there is no clear winner, the result is an all-out civil war between the people of Judah and the rest of Israel. Well, in one of the battles in this war, Joab's brother Asahel is in hot pursuit of Abner. Well, Abner doesn't want to kill Asahel, so he warns him to break off the chase. But Asahel refuses. Now, to make a long story short, since Abner can't talk to Asahel out of chasing him, he ends up killing him. Now, this was not murder, it was an act of war. In fact, it was almost an act of self-defense. But Joab refuses to accept that, and he wants to get revenge on Abner for killing his brother. Well, before Joab can get his revenge on Abner, David and Abner agree to stop the war. It seems that Abner is getting more and more bold in his bid for power in Israel. He's always been the power behind Ishbosheth. But he eventually gets to a point where he casts aside all pretenses and he starts sneaking into the bedroom of one of Saul's concubines. This act is really symbolic of the fact that Abner was trying to take over Saul's place. Well, Ishbosheth forgets that Abner is the one who is keeping him in power. So when Ishbosheth gets word that Abner is sleeping with one of Saul's concubines, he knows that Abner has his eye on the throne, so he accuses Abner of treason. Well, Abner gets his feathers ruffled. He reminds Ishbosheth that if it weren't for him, he wouldn't be king at all. Then he accuses Ishbosheth of ingratitude and reminds him of exactly who it is that really is in charge of the kingdom. Now, since the war hasn't been going very well, and Abner realizes that it's only a matter of time until David's forces win, he figures that this would be a good time to change over to the winning side. So he uses this opportunity to change sides in the war and join up with David. You see, Abner's scheme to use Ishbosheth as the puppet king isn't working out so well, so he offers to make David the king. He tells David that he has really been the one in charge all along and that Ishbosheth was just a puppet king. Then he promises to bring all of Israel over to David. But when Joab hears that David is actually considering Abner's offer, he is furious. Not only was Joab afraid that Abner might take his job as commander-in-chief of David's army, David was also thinking of making peace with the man that had killed his brother. So unbeknownst to David, Joab sends a messenger to ask Abner to return. Well, Abner figures that David must have reached a decision concerning his offer, so he returns to Hebron. When he arrives, Joab tells Abner that he wants to talk to him privately, and he and Abner go off alone. But instead of talking, he runs him through with a sword and kills him. So Joab has his revenge on Abner for killing his brother. Sounds like a soap opera, doesn't it? Now, since David and Abner had already agreed to stop the war, this makes Joab's actions in killing Abner an act of murder. Well, without Abner to back him up, Ishbosheth doesn't stand a chance, and he knows it. And as they used to say, he was too scared to spit. So 2 of his officers figured that they were going to get beaten by David's army anyway, so they may as well try to get on David's good side by killing Ishbosheth while he slept and taking his head to David. And by the way, Ishbosheth must have been a very lazy king when he was in bed sleeping at noon when they assassinated him. Well, these two guys must have thought that they would get a medal for killing Ishbosheth. But instead, David has them executed as murderers. So Ishbosheth and Abner are both dead, and the elders of Israel have had enough of the civil war. They really didn't want Ishbosheth as their king in the first place. They had only agreed to it because they were afraid of Abner. So since they come together at Hebron and they anoint David as the king of all of Israel. After more than 20 years of strife and civil war, Israel is finally united as one kingdom under the rule of one king. King David now sits on the throne of Israel. And notice this. They weren't defeated in a war and forced to submit to David's rule. They freely accepted the king that God had chosen to rule over them. Doesn't it warm your heart to hear that someone whose patience and persistence is rewarded? Patience and persistence in pursuing God's divine purpose for your life will always pay off. Habakkuk had this to say about it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. God's blessings will surely come to anyone who patiently and persistently works to accomplish God's will in their lives. But remember, Friday is not always payday on God's calendar. And you may not receive what God promised until you're in heaven. So, whenever you get discouraged, remember Habakkuk's words. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Now, look at verse 2 of chapter 5 of 2 Samuel. God tells David, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. Those few short words include the totality of what a godly leader is supposed to do. Shepherds are there to make sure that the sheep are properly cared for, and they are not to favor any one particular sheep. They need to make sure that all of them are cared for equally. Whether they are princes, presidents, or pastors, their job is to both feed and lead. For church leaders, the people are to be fed God's word and led into actions that are fueled by the truth. That, in a nutshell, is godly leadership. So David is anointed king of Israel for the third time. The first time was by Samuel in Bethlehem. Second time was by the tribe of Judah in Hebron. And the third time was by all of the elders in Israel. And after the third anointing, David rules until his death 33 years later. Of all the nations in Israel, none of them was more beloved by God and by the people that he ruled than David was. I mean, he was the perfect king. He did goof up occasionally. You know, one of the sure signs that the Bible was written by God and not by men is the fact that people as beloved as David are presented in the pages of Scripture with all of their faults. If the account of David's life had been written by men, they probably would have left out that little incident with Bathsheba and the fact that he had arranged to have her husband killed. But God shows us that even a perfect human king is not sinless. Even the best people still sin and are in need of a Savior. And that's even true for someone as perfect as David. He was someone who was said to be a man after God's own heart. So what's the point of all this? Well, the first thing that I want you to see is the fact that God does not use the same criteria for choosing his workers as men do. Men look at outward appearances, but God looks at the inward character. See, first impressions aren't always good impressions. Second, sometimes it takes a long time before God's promises are fulfilled, but they are always fulfilled. Third, God will make us wait until he can develop a good character within us before he will allow us to assume a leadership role. Very often, those times of waiting are designed to stretch our faith to the limits. And each stretch will make us stronger, and it will bring us closer to God because we'll see that we need to rely on his strength and not ours. You see, how we handle the wait is a good indicator of our spiritual maturity. Many people have failed in their faith and in their obedience during the times when God makes them wait. They also need to be extra careful during those times when God makes us wait, because Satan will very often try to capitalize on divine delays by attacking us. First, not all waiting is godly. As soon as God opens the door for us, we shouldn't hesitate to go through it. But there are a lot of lazy Christians. When God finally does open the door, instead of getting to work, they'll continue to sit there and wait. And they do that simply because they aren't willing to go to work for God. Fifth, we should still strive to accomplish things for the Lord even while we're waiting for another door to open. David was defending Israel against her enemies even during the times when Saul was trying to kill him. Even while he waited for God to put him on the throne, he was still working for the Lord. And David was preparing himself for the time when God would keep his promise and make him king of Israel. And sixth, as you wait, you have the assurance that God will always make it worth your trouble. If you're in a hurry, you can always go through the McDonald's drive-thru window and settle for a Happy Meal. But if you want a gourmet meal, you have to wait for it to be meticulously prepared. Great things don't happen instantly, and God isn't in any hurry. You need to ask yourself this question: how do I want to present my service to God? Do I want it to be a happy meal? Or am I willing to wait for God to make it a gourmet feast? When God's plan requires you to wait, He'll make it worth your while. You know, we admire David's complete trust in God. We admire his patience, his self-control, his courage, his enormous respect for Saul, and his care for all those who have supported him. All of the character qualities are reflections of the work that God is doing in David's heart while he was sitting there waiting for God to act on his behalf. Whenever we're looking for a spiritual leader, we need to consider the ways that God has worked in his life. We need to know how God called him from spiritual obscurity and led him to a position of spiritual leadership. We need to learn from David that waiting on the Lord is a normal part of living the Christian life. We will always be tempted to take shortcuts and bypass the wait. And we'll very often encounter others who are willing to help us do that. And that is disobedience to God's plan. That's how Satan tempted Jesus in the wilderness. Again, the devil took him to the very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, "All these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me." In other words, Satan says, "I know you've come here to win the kingdom of the world. Well, why wait? You can bypass the cross. All you need to do is worship me, and I'll give all these kingdoms to you right now." We need to keep in mind that when God makes us wait, He's using that time to prepare us for the job that He has in mind for us. We need to resolve in our hearts to be like David and wait on the Lord to fulfill His purposes and His promises. And most of all, we need to allow Him to do it in His good time. We also need to be equally resolved to continue doing the good things that we do know how to do, even while we're waiting on God to give us our next assignment. And if we'll do all those things, someday we'll hear Jesus say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of the Lord." Questions?